In the China-Pakistan economic corridor, there are lots of tunnels, and these tunnels allow Pakistan and China to hide missiles to use against India in the event of a confrontation. So there is a time now to do a fresh appraisal of what should be India's goals and what we are willing to give and take to settle a dispute with China, which is not going to be easy to resolve. And if we don't, be prepared for another Kargil-like conflict. The most recent reports based on satellite photographs of Chinese designs along the Aksai Chin, Pangong Lake area and making bridges connecting Chinese positions from the eastern side of the lake to the western side, where they come closer to Indian troops, should be a matter of alarm. It indicates very clearly that China is not willing to relent on its claims on Aksai Chin and settle along what India has been insisting are the boundary lines between Aksai Chin and Ladakh. And this is based on the Chinese desire to control Aksai Chin because of its massive mineral resources and the waters that it has, from where originates the Indus water systems, that some of the rivers come into the Kashmir Valley and the rest go into what we call POK and Pakistan and China calls the northern areas. But back to Spangur Gap and next to it the Pangong. Now the Pangong is a large lake. India apparently has about 40% of the lake under its control and China has 60% or more. It's a 700 square kilometer lake, one of the highest in the world, and an area which has seen demands and counter demands by both sides. And in the 1962 conflicts, the Chinese tried to move as far into the Indian side of Ladakh, what you call the western lines, and China laid out two claim lines. The first was before the conflict and the second was around the conflict and thereafter. These are based on Chinese assumptions that what they believe is their territorial requirement and hold over Aksai Chin. If you look at the map of India, and the top of India you have Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh. On the eastern side of Ladakh, right on the top, there's this big hook. This hook really comes out of a Johnson line that was spelt out by an Anglo-Indian cartographer called Mr. W.H. Johnson in 1865, who was prompted by the Maharaja of Kashmir to show the front of Kashmir towards Tibet as far eastwards as follows. The British were unhappy with it. They later came up with two sets of lines. One was the Johnson-Ardagh line, as they called it, and this became the line that the British were claiming, dividing Ladakh and Aksai Chin, running from the north of Aksai Chin going along the Kunlun mountain ranges towards somewhere near the Pangong. This was in 1897. And then there was another British official who created the Macartney-MacDonald line, which was in 1899. This was on the top of Aksai Chin, and this was the area where the British were hoping to hold back Russian forces trying to get into the Aksai Chin area. But even years later, during the time of Communist China, when Mao came into power, and the Soviet Union, which had a communist regime, they were exploiting this area for a lot of nuclear program related resources. Aksai Chin is rich in uranium, water resources and various other things that makes it a mineral hub that China would not let go. Whatever India's claims, whatever boundary maps that we make, We made one in Nehru's time in 1954, and that got the Chinese back up. We made another one more recently in the time of Prime Minister Modi's regime, and this has again upset the Chinese because there is really no agreed settlement over who should own what parts of Aksai Chin and Ladakh based on a dividing line. To that extent, there is a divide that runs along northern parts of Arunachal Pradesh in India's east that starts from the general area of Sikkim running via Bhutan and going on to the tri-junction of Myanmar, India and China, and that is known as the McMahon Line. Now the McMahon Line really came about in 1913-14 after a huge conference that the British had organized, not to define just India or China's boundary, but to define what was the southern limits of Tibet vis-a-vis India, because they also wanted to define the northern limits of Tibet based on what Tibet should be, because the Chinese are constantly pecking into Tibet and trying to take control of Tibet. This was an idea that came out really out of an expedition that the British Viceroy, Lord Curzon, had initiated in 1904, feeling the need to define the boundaries of Tibet. And an expedition was sent under Colonel Younghusband, who went and signed the Treaty of Lhasa, 1904. 2 years later, the Chinese claims and counterclaims led to another confrontation. And finally, the British decided that this must be settled. Anyway, lots of deliberations did not lead to a full and final settlement over the entire boundary between India and Tibet, or now India and China, because China occupied Tibet in 1952. What came to be was the McMahon Line by the gentleman who organized this conference, called Lieutenant Colonel Sir Henry McMahon. He was a line drawing expert. He also drew the line between Pakistan and Afghanistan today, which is known as the Durand Line. But McMahon was not successful in defining the boundaries of Aksai Chin. So Aksai Chin ended up having really three boundaries. One was the Johnson Line, as I said, which was the eastern hook from Ladakh going into Tibet. The second was the Johnson-Ardagh Line, which ran a little more towards India's side along the Kunlun mountain range. And finally, a British Consul General north of that area made the Macartney-McDonald Line, which was to hold back the Russian forces to come into this area, because the Russians are always trying to conquer this area. Why? That's the big question. Why is China holding on to this area? Because this area is immensely valuable, with mineral resources, with uranium, which you need for nuclear programs. And you may know that the first Soviet nuclear tests held north of this area, north of Jammu Kashmir and the entire territories of what was Jammu Kashmir, but now is divided between Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, and the POK held area, was at a place called Semipalatinsk. And Semipalatinsk is where the Soviets did an explosion of their first nuclear weapon, which was in 1949. So Aksai Chin was extremely valuable. It was an area where the Russian forces of the Tsar were eyeing. Thereafter, the Russians took control of this in the early 1900s. And by the time the Soviet regime came into place with Khrushchev and others in command in Moscow, and later there was a communist regime of China, this area was always being eyed at. When you look at it on the map, northwest of this area is a place called Semipalatinsk, which is north of Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, and what we call POK, where the Soviets did their first nuclear test, 1949. And in later years, this same area, if you go a little further along the Himalayas, the Chinese did their first nuclear test southeast of this area in Lucknow in 1964. So classically, this is an area which provides uranium resources. But what is it providing today? It provides China water resources and control of water resources that China desperately needs for its semiconductor program. Some of us might know that about 4 or 5 years ago, the Trump regime stopped export of semiconductors to China, which, as we know, is a very, very valuable product which is required for making microchips, from cell phones to satellites. A lot of it comes from semiconductors. So the Chinese decided that they need semiconductors, and semiconductors would come from fresh water accumulated and through chemical process mixed with the sands of the area just north of Aksai Chin. It's a place called the Taklamakan Desert. And that is the area the Chinese are targeting to produce their semiconductors. They have made investments in what is known as POK of at least 5 dams and worth $26 billion. There is the Bunji Dam, there's the Daimar Bhasha Dam, there is also the Thakot Dam, the Patan Dam, and many of these dams are up to 35 to 40 kilometers long. They accumulate a lot of fresh water, and the fresh water can be used to produce electricity, and thereafter the fresh water is available to mix with sand and other chemicals to produce silicon wafers. Because every 10,000 liters of fresh water allows you to produce 30 centimeters square of silicon wafers. And China wants to be a global leader in technology, in satellites, in cell phones, military systems. All that, much of it is linked with having semiconductors. So that is China's other agenda on Aksai Chin, other than, of course, keeping India unsettled with troop movements along Aksai Chin, like they've done with the most recent bridge that they are building across the Pangong, because that will allow them to move in tanks and heavy armored vehicles at short notice to unsettle Indian troops who are deployed on the south-western parts of the Pangong. And as long as India is deploying troops here and is unsettled, the pressure on Pakistan is eased off, which is China's most important strategic vassal state in South Asia. And India's attention being divided between Aksai Chin and the line of control gives Pakistan a breather. The third and most important thing that Pakistan and China are working towards is producing these semiconductors through dams. And finally, when China continues to keep control of Aksai Chin, this area that runs east of Ladakh, this huge stretch going from the Pangong Lake, going right up to the Depsang Plains, it is keen to make an inroad into what we call the northern areas of Pakistan. Why? Because China has invested heavily into the China-Pakistan economic corridor that runs from Xinjiang north of Aksai Chin via POK, goes via parts of Kashmir held by Pakistan and through Pakistan, and links China to the Gwadar port in the southern parts of Pakistan, and giving China access to the Arabian Sea, both for military, strategic and trade purposes, and drawing in energy and oil and gas from the Arab world through the shortcut route and bringing it into Xinjiang. And finally, the Chinese are looking at the China-Pakistan economic corridor as part of their larger Belt and Road initiative to establish their entire encirclement around India. So you have the BRI through Pakistan and POK, you have ports in southern parts of Pakistan like Gwadar, in Sri Lanka, Hambantota, you have an arrangement in the southern parts of Myanmar to clearly strategically encircle India. And there are reports that in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, there are lots of tunnels And these tunnels allow Pakistan and China to hide missiles to use against India in the event of a confrontation. So where do we go from here? One, we need to do a reality check, because there has been a proposal to India from 59-60 onwards by the Chinese, by the first Chinese Prime Minister, who I'm sure had Mao Zedong's approval, and his name was Kargil-Like. He gave a proposal to Pandit Nehru's government that let us settle our disputes and you let us hold on to Aksai Chin, which in any case doesn't have an agreed and demarcated border between the two sides. There are claim lines. So India's claim line is now more or less around what was the British claim line of 1897, which is the Johnson-Ardagh line that runs along Aksai Chin. And the Chinese claim line was a little closer to Ladakh, which is the line they came into accepting in 1899. In fact, Chinese maps in the time of Mao Zedong also showed Aksai Chin as part of India. So there's a lot of confusion. Now, I am not able to fathom what these 22 or 24 rounds of special representative talks between India and China have given us, except just a lot of hope and nothing on the table. Because if we had, at least the sides would have exchanged maps and started the debate and moved forward into what we are willing to accept and what they are willing to give. China wants to be the biggest power in the world. It is not going to settle by giving us all our demands and going on the back foot and announcing to its people we've settled the problems with India by giving into all of India's demands. That was the problem when Kargil-Like made a proposal to Pandit Nehru that you keep all the areas of Arunachal Pradesh south of the McMahon line and we keep Aksai Chin. Let's do a east-west swap as it came to be known. Panditji, in all his arrogance and wisdom, said McMahon line is a boundary that is settled and we are not willing to give any part of Aksai Chin, though not a blade of grass grows there. China didn't see grasslands as important. They saw the reserves, the waterways, the mineral resources, and the location for it to continue to link up with the entire area of POK as of strategic advantage. And most importantly, China has a highway that runs from Kashgar in Xinjiang and goes to Tibet. It is known as G219. The further that China pushes Indian troops, as it tried in 2020 around Galwan, the more depth it gives to this highway so that Indian artillery cannot bomb Chinese vehicles if they are going up and down into two sensitive capitals of China, in Xinjiang and Tibet, where there's always anti-Beijing riots and uprisings. They need this connectivity. Therefore, the importance of this location to China. Nobody in India, as far as I know, has articulated what is the importance of Aksai Chin to India, except to say that, oh, this is part of a map that we have in our mind, that is a part of Indian territory that we must have. So Panditji's thing was, McMahon line is settled. As far as Aksai Chin is concerned, that is also ours. So the Chinese asked, then what should we get? And there were no answers. And we've had multiple visits to Beijing and Delhi. We have special representatives and their foreign ministers of both countries meeting. But there has been no movement forward because India is not very clear what it wants. As far as the Chinese are concerned, they will wait to eternity to have what was spelt out by Mao Zedong as their strategic agenda. And what was that? Mao said, Tibet is the palm of my hand, and the 5 regions adjoining it, Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal, are all Chinese territories because people look like us, people speak our kind of dialect and language, and we must have complete control over that. Is there a counter-Indian narrative? No. Except we have officials from the Foreign Office, even today, saying that this territory is ours and we don't accept any argument. Funnily enough, the MEA spokesman of today is echoing the same line of the Congress-led government of Pandit Nehru. And when the Chinese made another proposal after the 62 conflict, there were diplomats in South Block who have confirmed to me that they pushed it aside, saying that if we settle it even now, we'll be disloyal to Panditji's legacy. Disloyalty or no loyalty, we do not present a picture of coherence to the Chinese, unlike what the Chinese have continued to present to us. So there is a time now to do a fresh appraisal of what should be India's goals and what we are willing to give and take to settle a dispute with China, which is not going to be easy to resolve. And if we don't, be prepared for another Kargil-like conflict.